Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. At the beginning of each month, I usually make a video talking about 8 or 10 books scheduled for publication that particular month. Occasionally, I get so overwhelmed with forthcoming books, all coming out in that one month, that I decide to split my discussion into 2 videos, one for the beginning of the month and one for the books coming out later in the month. And June is a very full time in the publishing world, or at least it is for the particular kinds of books that I want to talk about. So today I'll talk about 8 books that will be released in the first half or so, and then there'll be a bit of a sequel in the second half of the month. Before I get started with my list, I will say that mine is a very personal list, full of my personal taste and quirky obsessions. In other words, this is in no way exhaustive of all that is coming out. All right, the first book I want to discuss came out yesterday, June 3rd, from Scribner, and it has my very favorite title of the day, The Haves and Have-Yachts, Dispatches on the Ultrarich by Evan Osnos. This is a collection of essays about the people of what is effectively the new Gilded Age, the people who have not only outrageous wealth, but also increasingly outrageous power. In other words, Osnos is writing about the oligarchs of our world. And some of the essays focus on the culture of consumption. For example, he talks about $500,000 birthday parties for toddlers and bat mitzvah celebrations for 13-year-olds featuring some of the biggest names in pop music, etc. But the author doesn't just talk about unimaginable outlays of money. He's also writing about how wealth from Silicon Valley and Wall Street, etc., leads to what Osnos calls unprecedented Washington influence. Clearly, this is one of the most important topics in the events of American politics and government today. I mentioned that this book is a collection of essays. They were originally published, or at least most of the essays were originally published, in the New Yorker, but they've been expanded and revised to make what is essentially a coherent narrative. While I have read many of these essays in the pages of the New Yorker, I'm really looking forward to thinking about the collection as an expanded whole. Okay, on to the next book. On June 10th, Farrar, Straus and Giroux will release Homework, a memoir by beloved writer Geoff Dyer. This is really his first personal piece, I think. His story of growing up as the only child of a sheet metal worker and one of the employees working in the school cafeteria, living in Britain. During a particular moment in history, the middle to late years of the 20th century, when the culture was still haunted by both the Great Depression and World War II. Despite these historical ghosts, this book is a story of love and joy, written with great wit, not surprisingly, and also the memory of growing up at a time when people assumed their future lives would be full of opportunity. And Dyer tells how his own life echoed that bygone Britain. Let me share one piece of advance praise that I really love. As Billy Collins says, quote, "Homework is a stunning feat of retrieval, rendered in such minute detail, you would think Dyer had consumed an entire tin of Madeleines." Also on the 10th, from W. W. Norton, is Susan Gubar, a feminist literary scholar who has been widely respected in the field for decades. Her new book is called Grand Finales, The Creative Longevity of Women Artists. Almost 20 years ago, Gubar faced a cancer diagnosis with an expected prognosis of only a few years. She outlived that dire prognosis, as the publisher's note calls it, but the experience sparked in her a new question. Essentially, what does creativity look like during the last years of our lives? And to explain the way she goes about answering that question, I'll read you my favorite line from the pub sheet. Gubar spotlights very creative old ladies, writers, painters, sculptors, musicians, and dancers from the past and in our times. Each of Gubar's chapters focus on a different artist or writer who, quote, transformed the last stage of existence into a rousing conclusion. She looks at George Eliot, Georgia O'Keeffe, Marianne Moore, Colette, Isaac Denison, and others, making the argument that partly because older people, especially older women perhaps, are often dismissed, the final years of one's life can sometimes spark a new way of thinking about the world and one's place in it. And what I truly hope is Gubar's line. The pub sheet calls it geezer machismo. While I'm not quite yet at the old lady age Gubar is talking about, I am very much looking forward to her book. The whole idea of the personal development of authors and other artists interests me quite a bit. Another book coming out on the 10th is The Third Solitude, a memoir against history by Benjamin Libman, which will be published by Dundurn Press in Canada. This is a book about coming to terms with identity and its complexities. The author grew up in a Jewish family in Montreal and tries to make sense of how the traditions of Judaism and the history of the Jewish people, especially during the Holocaust, affected his family life. He also writes about French-Canadian culture in the world where he grew up. I am extremely interested in reading this book, but I'm also a little worried about it since I know it addresses the current turmoil in Israel and Palestine. I spend a lot of time talking with friends and activists about what is happening in Gaza and more broadly in other Palestinian areas as well as Israel, and I read quite a bit from a variety of perspectives. Still, or maybe because of that, I'm not sure I want to read a personal account of anyone right now who is as removed from the issue as it seems the author is, especially because I know publishing takes a long time and whatever is written in the book will be out of date by the time it's in print. Nevertheless, it sounds like it might be quite thoughtful. Let me read from the publisher's description. The author, quote, leads us through the many fragments that make a life, unafraid to question deeply cherished beliefs about Jewish identity, and seeks to reconcile his own values with those inculcated in him. Along the way, he casts aside tired tropes and shores together the pieces of a new way of looking toward the future. It sounds meaningful. One more book to be published on the 10th, and this one is also a Canadian release, I think. It is a new translation of Dante's The Inferno, translated by Lorna Goodison, winner of the Derek Walcott Prize for Poetry and Jamaica's Poet Laureate from 2017 to 2020. If you've not yet read Dante, this is not the place to start. This is not precisely a translation, although I called it that. It's almost a reimagining of Dante's poem. It's written in Jamaican patois, full of Jamaican expressions and sayings that might or might not appeal to you. But there is an extra wrinkle to this story. What the publisher says is that Goodison attempts for the Caribbean vernacular what Dante did for the Italian. This is a bit of a side discussion, but I've been thinking a lot about how authors have used vernacular speech, from Creole languages to dialect to in-group slang, in literature. In part, my thoughts have been inspired by the wonderful discussions about relatively unremembered Pulitzer Prize winners presented by the great booktuber Too Tight Lautrec. And partly, the interest was inspired by thinking about the dialogue going on between Mark Twain and Percival Everett. It really seems to me that Goodison's translation / reimagining of Dante might have something to add here as well. A few days later, on the 13th, comes Penelope's Bones, a new history of Homer's world through the women written out of it by Emily Hauser. This one will be published by the University of Chicago Press. The cover of this book looks quite a bit like all those feminist retellings of Greek and Roman classics that have been so popular in recent years. But this book is a work of scholarship, using both literary and archaeological evidence to piece together what we know about the lives of women in Bronze Age Greece. The author investigates what scholars have learned from the excavation of Troy, the deciphering of the tablets written in Linear B listing captive women, the discovery of the curious contents of the Griffin warrior tomb, DNA evidence about a group of what the pub sheet calls Amazon-like female fighters, information about prehistoric dye works, that's DYE, that is in dyeing textiles for weaving, etc. Just to be clear, Hauser is talking about the everyday experiences of real historical women, women who, as the pub sheet says, stand behind the legends of Homer's female characters, like Helen and Calypso and Penelope, etc., not as direct inspiration, but as women who lived in the same period of time that Homer's epics emerged. The intention of the book is to develop the context for Homer, not provide a reimagining of the stories or anything like that. And that makes this book far more interesting to me than a retelling would be. But I'm quite aware that some of you might see that in exactly the opposite way. I do want to mention another book, a recent publication that might be an interesting pair with Penelope's Bones, and that is The Epic Women of Homer, Exploring Women's Roles in the Iliad and Odyssey by Eirene Allen, which was released at the end of March by Pen and Sword. Let me read from the pub sheet. Quote, "The story of the Iliad is not the story of Achilles, just as the story of the Odyssey is not the story of Odysseus alone. Contrary to centuries of reception, the epics are not only about fearless yet flawed men, but rather explore and develop the contours of belonging and community in times of war and peace." Many people consider the classic Homeric hero to be an individual fighting for personal glory, but the author argues that this is a misconception. She explains that knowing more about oral tradition, from which the epics emerged, suggests that the epics are deeply enmeshed in relationships as well. Essentially, just to compare this book to the previous one, Epic Women seems to be more about literary history or narrative history than social history. Well, I've been talking mostly, maybe completely, about nonfiction so far, but now I'm going to mention a forthcoming novel. Granted, the author is well known for her nonfiction. Heather Clark is the author of the fabulous Red Comet, the recent biography of Sylvia Plath, and she has a biography in the works of the poet Anne Sexton, a book I am very much looking forward to. But this month, she's publishing what I think is her first novel, called The Scrapbook, and it will be released on June the 17th. This novel is the story of Anna, who's about to graduate from Harvard in the mid-1990s with a degree in literature, who meets and falls for a visiting German student named Christoph. She follows him to Germany, thinking about the photos of her grandfather in his old scrapbook. He was an American GI who saw the liberation of Holocaust victims and participated in the capture of Hitler's Eagle Nest. Christoph, quote, remains cryptic about what his own grandfather did and saw in those same years. You might already be guessing that the story of these two lovers is going to be braided together with chapters about their grandfathers during the war, men who were fighting on opposite sides. To be honest, that sounds almost too pat to me, but I have great trust in the narrative abilities of Heather Clark, and I'm quite moved by the idea of exploring how history can hold such incredible power in the lives of people living many decades later. My understanding is that the World War II scrapbook Clark writes about was inspired by the real-life scrapbook that belonged to the author's grandfather, but that the relationship, etc., are completely fictional. I'm quite intrigued. And for any of you participating in the Read Historical Fiction 2025 read-along, this might be a great choice. And the last book I want to mention today is The Omnivore's Deception, What We Get Wrong About Meat, Animals, and Ourselves by John Sanbonmatsu, to be published on the 17th by NYU Press. There have been a great number of books about the ethical and environmental issues surrounding our food choices over the last few decades, and this book is a new and fierce one. As the pub sheet lays out at the very beginning, the author feels that raising animals for food is unethical in all cases, whether we're talking about factory-based animal agriculture or free-range farms. In other words, instead of talking about issues of sustainability, the author is speaking directly about, quote, existential and moral purpose, arguing for abolition of the entire animal economy. He says that what Michael Pollan, author of The Omnivore's Dilemma, and other food writers have considered humane meat is simply a contradiction in terms. This book presents not just the realities of animal agriculture, but the evidence that we have that non-human animals have a sense of self, etc. I've only looked through this book fairly quickly at this point, but while I find much of it well argued, there are some aspects of Sanbonmatsu's narrative strategies that are off-putting to me. For example, he's well known for comparing animal agriculture to the Holocaust in Germany and other human atrocities. I'm not certain that my resistance to that kind of rhetoric is something everyone would feel, but for me, referencing those historical events just in order to talk about a different situation as equally evil seems manipulative rather than convincing. To me, the situations are different, and I'm not talking about a scale of what is most evil, but in the particulars, specifically targeting Jews, the Roma, gays and lesbians, trans people, people with disabilities, etc., was done with the central goal of killing those people and removing them from society. In the few cases where products were made from their corpses, it was to celebrate the killing, not to produce items deemed necessary. The killing of animals, on the other hand, has not been done in that way. No matter how evil one might think the killing is, workers in animal agriculture have as the key goal the production of food for humans, with the acceptance of the death as a little considered corollary. Perhaps when I read Sanbonmatsu's book more deeply, I will rethink my perspective. But right now, as an historian, I'm troubled by his oversimplification of historical events and motivations. But maybe motivations and intentions are just not the things that matter here. Similarly, I'm sympathetic to his frustration with the tiny step of memes like Meatless Mondays, but I dislike his utter dismissal of them, as akin to pledging not to be racist on Tuesday. Yes, I think baby steps are better than no steps. Although I do realize that it's possible that baby steps might persuade people to think they're doing enough. But what troubles me more is his absolute erasure of the historical complexities of racism. Is this my own sense of hierarchy at work? Perhaps. And I have one rather weird point of resistance, again, not to veganism, but to the argumentation. Sanbonmatsu gives a critique of the dramatic and hierarchical division we imagine between humans and other animals, and suggests that we should consider our moral obligations to all animals in the planet. My question is, if we accept the idea that we should not impose a dualistic vision separating humans from other animals, shouldn't we avoid imposing a dualistic vision separating us from other life forms? If you've read the astonishing book Planta Sapiens, you know that plants too have an inner life. Now, I'm not at all suggesting that we should stop eating plants, but thinking of plants as fundamentally unlike animals is dualism too, relying on assumptions that humans have long felt about animals. What do we do with that? Well, this is really not a particularly happy place to end on, is it? My apologies. I have a lot of reading and thinking to do. But that will do it for this video today. As I said before, I'll probably make another video about more books coming out in the latter part of June, starting with a few more books to be released on the 17th. I hope all of you will have lots of happy reading this month. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.